Good evening, and welcome to my presentation on Taoism, a compare and contrast to Christianity. Compared to Christianity, Taoism is a smaller religion and little discussed in the West. So, to quickly poll the audience, how many of you would say you know something about Taoism? You can raise your hand. Okay, there's a good number here. For the sake of recording, maybe mine doesn't count, but maybe 30 to 40%. That's not too many. So thanks for raising your hands. For the rest of you, perhaps you're coming into this presentation thinking Taoism is shrouded in mystery, a religion entirely foreign to us in the U.S. But what if I told you that you've encountered Taoist ideas more often than you may have previously thought? If you don't believe it, how about now? This brief experiment, hopefully, is an appropriate introduction to the religion of Taoism. It's hard to fully define, but concepts within it underlie philosophies and cultures popularized even within our own mainstream media. And perhaps that is the most succinct way to define it. Taoism is the religion of underlying reality. So in the remainder of this presentation, we'll take a look at an introduction to Taoism, its history, its major theological stances, and my personal understanding of how it conflicts with Christianity. We'll conclude with the questions and answers period. And so without further ado, let's begin with a brief introduction to Taoism. So as I mentioned before, Taoism is a difficult religion to define. It revolves around this idea of the Tao. But according to Taoists themselves, this is difficult to define itself. And yet, not constraining the Tao to a strict definition seems to be a part of the religion itself, in a way. So the word Tao comes from the Mandarin word Dao. And in English, we might translate Dao as the way, the path, or the road. So what way or path or road, you might ask? It's the way of nature or the universe or underlying reality, the way that things really are. Taoism, therefore, is the way of achieving balance. Balance with the universe and ultimate reality, and a corresponding balance within oneself, this idea of inner peace. And by the way, the yin and yang symbol shown here is a classic Taoist symbol. Yin and yang represent this idea of the balance that composes reality. Reality exists in duality, light and dark, hot and cold, action and inaction. One way of thinking of the different colors, too, is that white represents good and black represents evil. And even the black dot in the white represents how there's always a little bit of evil and good. And the white dot in the black represents how there's a little bit of good and evil. There's no strict duality. It all kind of blurs. The origin of Taoism itself is debated. Modern people, especially in the West, generally believe that Taoism began as a set of philosophical principles. But more learned scholarly work asserts that Taoism has more mystic or shamanic origins. Before the official beginning of Taoism, there were groups of people who sought control over spiritual forces. When Taoist philosophers arrived on the scene, they transformed the shamanic worldview into a more natural understanding of reality. But over time, Taoism has continually developed as both philosophy and religion throughout history. So, speaking of the way, the path, and the road, we might ask, what is the path Taoism took to becoming what it is today? And to answer that question, let's look at the history of Taoism, beginning with its foundational text. So the first one shown here is called the Nei Ye. It was written by anonymous authors, and it teaches the internalization of spiritual forces. It introduces a popular idea known as qi, which we may be familiar with, as well as these other forces called qing and shen, which we can achieve through meditation and self-control. Qi can be translated or thought of as life energy. Qing is vital essence, and Shen is spiritual consciousness. The Ne'er was written over a period of time, likely compiled during the middle 4th century BC. It's a short text. It influenced Taoist practices of meditation to achieve inner balance and quiet. The second major text is the Chuang Tzu. It's compiled during the latter half of the 4th century BC, and it consists of a series of story-based lessons, kind of like parables or fables with morals. It was originally 52 chapters before being trimmed to 33 by a guy named Kuo Sang in the 3rd century BC. And like the Ne'er, its contents are taken from multiple authors, some of them known, but not entirely. A guy named Zhuang Zhou is responsible for the first 7, and his followers are believed to have written the rest. The Chuang Tzu introduces doubt about several areas of common human assumptions, things that we might think of as common sense, or the reliability of rational thought. And it blurs the boundaries between things like life and death, and what's human and non-human. It emphasizes the need for a reformed perspective on reality, but doesn't give any particular directions on how to obtain that perspective. It's here that the idea of the Tao is introduced, not as a cosmic force or principle, but simply as reality, the way that things really are. And the final major text is the Tao Te Ching, which is perhaps the most famous of these texts of Taoism. It's believed to have been compiled around the 3rd century BC and traditionally ascribed to some guy named Lao Tzu. However, academic works believe that Lao Tzu translates to the elders of a region called Chu, not that is one particular person, that these were principles of wisdom gathered from these elders and orally passed down over time, ultimately one day transcribed by a political figure for political purposes, an unknown intellectual. The Tao Te Ching emphasizes ideas of simplicity and self-restraint and so-called feminine behaviors. It refers to the Tao as the source and principle of all things, sort of like a universal mother. And it builds on the Chuang Tzu, on the idea of the ideal human, the sage, as a person who acts like the Tao, like the ultimate reality. So for a quick comparison to the documents of Christianity, these documents were written after the earliest scriptures in our Bible and before the latest scriptures in our Bible. It covers a narrow span of time and is not known specifically who the author is. In terms of genre types, there are some similarities between writing the Bible and these three described here. The Ne'er and the Tao Te Ching are poetic, sort of like the wisdom books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And the Chuang Tzu is a collection of fables with lessons, kind of like the parables of Jesus, or parables throughout the Bible. But the Bible has genres beyond that, including historical narrative, visions, prophecies, songs, and more. So these texts, many centuries later, led to various historical movements of Taoism after Jesus' life on earth. There's 4 main ones we'll look at today, kind of analogous perhaps to the progress of the church and changes in structure and denominations over time. But most of these, the first 3 discussed here, are no longer in existence today. So the first is called the Tian Shi, or the Celestial Master Movement. It was in existence from the 2nd to 7th centuries or so, founded by a person named Chang Taoling. He claimed to be this celestial master. And the celestial master is someone who came from heaven to rectify the world. Followers operated according to a surprisingly church-like hierarchy, where there were ordained ministers who oversaw lay people's practice of the faith. They taught forgiveness of sins through confession and works. This movement was described as the only truly mass-based Taoist movement among the people, with leadership separate from social status. And key teachings center on moral living and right relationship with spiritual forces. There was a lot of similarities between that and different denominations within Christianity. Later on was the aristocratic Taoism movement from the 6th to 10th centuries. This movement adapted some of the ideas of the Tianxi movement, and it introduced models of self-cultivation that allowed Taoists to achieve a higher spiritual standing, to become essentially a god in their thinking. And current and subsequent movements built upon this idea of achieving immortality and divinity. One subset of aristocratic Taoism had the goal of believers ascending to perfection. These believers hoped in a sort of Messiah, the Hoshan, who had come to save those who had prepared themselves for heaven. The next significant movement was the Tao Chao movement of the 6th to 12th centuries, concurrent with the aristocratic Taoism movement. And this movement was in competition with Buddhism and Confucianism. So followers of the previous traditions sought to create a more standardized form of Taoism, which is one of the reasons that it's also referred to as the ecumenical movement, a movement to unite the various forms of Taoism into one. This practice of Taoism simultaneously appealed to the intellectual and philosopher, to the mystic and spiritual, and the pious and devoted. Then the final movement, which is still in practice today, is what's called the late imperial Taoism movement of the 10th century until the present. There's 3 primary characteristics within this movement. The first is that it adapted to the changing needs of its practitioners over time. And second, it spread throughout all levels of Chinese society. And third, it reconciled itself with other more popular traditions, such as Confucianism. Political upheavals and leadership changes over time led to a greater inclusion of varied practices labeled as Taoist that would not have been accepted in earlier eras. The Cultural Revolution of the 60s and 70s particularly saw government oppression of any religion outside the societal and cultural norms, which led to more inclusive practices. So, looking at Taoism today, geographically, the largest number of Taoists still come from China. Taoism has spread to adjacent nations, but the vast majority of people who identify as Taoists are still of Chinese descent. Estimates vary pretty widely, depending if we count those who practice pure Taoism or those who are more syncretic and have mixed it in with other folk religions. But according to worlddata.info, as of this past July, the 4 countries with the most professing Taoists were China, with almost 62 million, Taiwan with 10.5 million, Hong Kong with a little more than 1 million, and Singapore with 680,000. Interestingly, Taiwan, percentage-wise, is the most Taoist nation, reported at 44%, according to this report. And altogether, that's about 74 million, give or take, in those 4 countries alone, or about 0.9% of the world population. Compared to Christianity, estimates for Christianity vary pretty widely within each of these countries, particularly within China and Taiwan. Nevertheless, within these countries, it seems that there's a comparable number of Christians to Taoists in each except Taiwan, which has about 7 times as many professing practitioners of Taoism than Christianity. But worldwide, Christianity claims about 2.5 billion adherents, or 30.4% of the global population. So you've likely met far more Christians than Taoists, especially in the US. Looking at Taoism today in modern China, some of those defining characteristics of late imperial Taoism, such as the adaptability over time, can be explained by looking at the recent history of Taoism in China. Starting in 1949, when the communist regime took power in China, Taoism was banned entirely under the Communist Party. And until recently, it was denied open practice until current president of China, Xi Jinping, changed the stance of the CCP on religion. Today, Taoism is one of China's 5 official religions, though it's not tolerated as much as Han Buddhism. The other 3 are Han Buddhism, Catholicism, Christianity, other than Catholicism, and Islam. And Taoism and Buddhism are seen as more Chinese, more atheist, and therefore more accepted and more tolerated. So compared to the history of Christianity, there's some resemblance to movements within Christianity. For one, the Tianxi belief that a celestial master would come to set the world right bears a lot of resemblance to Christian teachings regarding the first and second comings of Jesus, and the ministerial hierarchy of the celestial master movement resembles the Christian church at various times. Yeah. So, looking at practices in place today, there's various ways that you might see a Taoist practice their beliefs. The first is meditation and ritualistic breathing. These are done to cultivate and balance qi, that life energy within the universe. Second is traditional Chinese medicine, such as acupuncture, cupping, herbal medicines, and so on. They actually have their root in Taoist principles, though not everyone who not everyone who practices traditional Chinese medicine identifies as Taoist. It's based on these ideas of flow of energy, that comes from Taoism. Tai Chi, in the top right there, is traditionally a martial art. Historically, it has been used to fight, but in recent days, is more so done for the sake of benefiting your long-term health, reducing stress, practicing balance and coordination, and no longer so much used to fight, but if it is, for self-defense. It's believed to cultivate awareness of the body and mental clarity. In the bottom left there, that's feng shui, which is the practice of arranging a space in ways to maximize the cultivation of qi, balancing the items within a space with the rest of the environment. And in the bottom right there, that's temple rituals, such as offering sacrifices to Taoist deities, or holding festivals and ceremonies and other priestly rites. So, we might not regularly see these on a daily basis, but within Western culture, there are some familiar places where we see Taoist ideas, particularly in our mainstream media. So, some of you may or may not be familiar with these shows and movies. The Avatar: The Last Airbender is largely based on ideas behind Taoism, Hinduism, and Buddhism. This idea of flow of energy and blurring the lines between duality of good and evil and the spiritual realm. Star Wars, surprisingly, perhaps, the Force is an idea pretty analogous to yin and yang, to the duality of the universe, to the Tao. there's a light side and a dark side, and yet the force itself is neutral. It's what underlies reality in Star Wars. And the saying from the show The Mandalorian, "This is the way," bears some resemblance to Taoist philosophies, though the Mandalorian's a little more violent. And then finally, Kung Fu Panda 2. Kung Fu Panda as a whole, but particularly in the second movie, if some of you have seen it, a main theme is inner peace and going with the flow of nature. It's one of the critical moments in the movie where Po the panda discovers inner peace and also uses it for violence. Not comedy with not really Taoist in that, but okay. So I wanted to share some common lessons and sayings from Taoism here. It might be a little hard to see if I can read them out loud, if I can read it. So Lao Tzu, the person ascribed to the Tao Te Ching, even though he's probably multiple people, he said some common sayings that we might be familiar with, like, "A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." Or, "The wise man is one who knows what he does not know." Some less common sayings, but key to understanding Taoism, would be, "If you are depressed, you're living in the past. If you are anxious, you're living in the future. If you are at peace, you're living in the present. And if you want to awaken all of humanity, then awaken all of yourself. If you want to eliminate the suffering in the world, then eliminate all that is negative in yourself. Truly, the greatest gift you have to give is that of your own self-transformation." There's a lot of emphasis on living in the present, going with the flow, and actualizing yourself. So from there, we're going to take a look at different theological stances, beginning with the Taoist idea of purpose. So because the Taoist religion emphasizes harmony with the Tao and adapting behavior both to be authentic to oneself and to flow with reality, the purpose of Taoism is to seek that harmony with reality. So in the practice discussed previously, cultivate this life energy of Qi, which is achieved when one is in balance with the universe. Taoist ethics today emphasize 3 virtues, the first being effortless action, then naturalness and simplicity. Effortless action, or wu wei, is the principle of living by free-flowing and unforced activity, just as the Tao seems to move subtly and effortlessly. Naturalness is the quality of spontaneity and self-rule, a sort of creative power or energy. And simplicity is related to naturalness and refers to the natural state of humanity. The word to refer to it, pu, literally means uncarved wood. According to my Taoist friend, there's no real seen need for evangelism within Taoism. Taoists seem pretty content to live and let live for the most part, concerned more about their own practice of religion and philosophy, and considering some of these principles, that does make sense. Now, similar to Taoism on this point, Christianity also teaches that there is a purpose for our lives that is, in a sense, natural. But that purpose is natural to who we were created to be, followers and worshippers of God in a personal relationship with Him, rather than discovering and aligning with who we perceive ourselves to be today, with the way that things are today in a broken world. The end purpose is therefore not to live in accordance with present reality, but the future redeemed reality. And so Christians pursue not effortless action, but wholehearted labor unto the Lord. Naturalness, by rejection of self-rule, not simplicity, but submission to God's authority. And Christianity has a strong emphasis on evangelism, which come naturally from the Christian perspectives on salvation and eternity, as we'll turn to now. So within Taoism, there is a concept within religious Taoism of salvation, not so much the philosophical side for those who purely practice it as a philosophy, but within religious Taoism, according to my friends, the end purpose of Taoism is escaping this cycle of reincarnation by achieving a higher spiritual state as a god. In that way, it's kind of similar to Hinduism in that this doctrine of reincarnation is present. It assigns one's next life according to how well you live your life now. One difference, though, is that the highest form of life you can reincarnate into is humanity. Taoists see humans as the ultimate form of creation because we can become gods and possess wisdom that animals don't have, all the wisdom in the world. So why is this the idea of salvation? Because reincarnation is torture. So to be saved from reincarnation, to be saved from living in this broken and suffering world, happens only to the best Taoists. That's how they're saved, and they enter heaven or hell as gods or ghosts, respectively. Similar to Christianity, or to Taoism, Christianity believes that there is suffering in the world, and life can seem torturous at times, but salvation is not freedom from a cycle of reincarnation, but from the sin inside each of us that has separated us from God for eternity. Humanity is indeed the pinnacle of God's creation, but we do not possess the wisdom required to effect our own salvation. Then finally, eternity. Within philosophical Taoism, there's no clear doctrine of heaven or hell. Eternity is viewed as a reunion with the Tao, the ultimate reality. But religious Taoism does have a concept of heaven and hell. And these are, funnily enough, organized like Chinese dynasties. So heaven and hell are kind of complicated. There is an ultimate God over heaven who appoints different stations within heaven, but also different stations within hell. And hell is not necessarily a bad place, because going to heaven or hell breaks the cycle of reincarnation, and punishment within hell is temporary and for specific sins. It's kind of in this idea of eternity that religious Taoism borrows ideas from Buddhism. For instance, there's 18 levels of hell, each one for a different type of sin. But yeah, the goal is to become one of those appointed to a place within heaven or hell and get out of reincarnation. Similar to Taoism, Christianity believes in two destinations after this life, heaven and hell. But these two locations look pretty different in Christianity. There's only one God. He dwells in heaven with his people who are still human. They're not gods. They don't become gods. And they're people who trust in him rather than themselves to get there. And hell, in most Orthodox Christian traditions, does consist of eternal punishment and separation from the divine. Then finally, looking at the religious structure, in Taoism there's no central authority. There's no pope, there's no organized system of authority, so to speak. But there are two major branches within them of clergy. The first one is called the Zhengyi, or the Orthodox Unity Taoism. And within this tradition, priests are hereditary, kind of like in the Old Testament, priests passed down by lineage. Priests tend to serve their local communities and are actively involved. There's an emphasis on ritual services such as exorcisms, blessings, and funerals. And it's integrated with local folk religion, such as other Chinese traditional beliefs. The other major branch is Chuanzhen, or complete reality Taoism. And this tradition is more monastic, similar to Buddhism. Monks and nuns live in monasteries. And there's an emphasis on asceticism, meditation, and self-cultivation. And this branch promotes detachment from ordinary life. Within the Chuanzhen tradition, monks and nuns are forbidden from marriage. So perhaps a natural consequence of this is that there's a lot more Zhengyi Taoists. And then the temples house the ministers, such as priests and monks, and they serve as locations to hold their rituals and festivals. So we compared it in different ways along the way, but some final closing thoughts on how Taoism conflicts with Christianity. To be perfectly clear, the problems that I see within it are just where it doesn't agree with Christianity. And so these are some verses that describe those conflicts. The first one is John 14, verse 6. Jesus says, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Jesus says he's the only way to the divine, the way, and to eternal life. No man-made way will succeed to get us into heaven except through him. Second is Jeremiah 17, verse 9. "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" As much as humanity may try to find its inner self, two problems will result. First, we won't understand ourselves fully. And second, we will deceive ourselves about what is good and right. Third, Colossians 1, 21, 22. To summarize, it talks about how we were separated from God, but reconciled through Christ. So the big issue is not that humanity lacks inner peace or peace with our environment, but peace with God. And only through Jesus' sacrifice may we be forgiven and restored to a right relationship with him. Then Romans 3:30 and Numbers 23:19. "There is only one God, and God is not human that he should lie, not a human being that he should change his mind. So God was not a man, and man will not become God." And finally, Hebrews 9, verse 27. "People are destined to die once, and after that, to face judgment." Within Christianity, there is no concept of reincarnation. So, to conclude, I can sympathize with a lot of the real problems that Taoists attempt to solve. The suffering of this world, the desire for eternal life, the reality of spiritual forces, and desire to have power over them. But given my knowledge of Jesus, whom Taoism denies, I understand that the Tao solution is a false hope to real and eternal problems. Purpose and salvation are found only in Jesus, and so without Jesus, there's no hope to be found in Taoism. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to any questions. Thank you. Yes.
Is there any space in Taoism for I guess spirits or spiritual powers influencing the world? Are those gods still interacting, or is it deists?
Yeah. So according to my friend, those gods and ghosts in heaven and hell, from my understanding, they kind of stay in heaven and hell. But there's some ghosts who can become evil and influence the world, according to my one friend. So there does seem to be an idea of spiritual forces influencing our world today. Yeah.
How does one become a ghost? Because you said if they do well enough that they become a god. So is it if they do so badly that they become a ghost or something?
Yeah, so when he said ghost, he doesn't, I don't know if that's the proper word in English. That's the word he used. But he seemed to refer to ghosts as those who go to hell, as opposed to gods who go to heaven. And yet they're both spiritual sasses above humanity. And it's not necessarily bad to be in hell. It's just not as good as heaven. Yeah.
Does ancestral worship play into Taoism?
I didn't read anything specifically about that, but there's a lot of syncretism, which is integrating other folk religions into Taoism. So I wouldn't see necessarily a problem with the Taoists practicing that. Yeah.
What's the Taoist viewpoint on who Jesus is?
I have no idea.
Okay.
When one achieves the highest level, I get when they get to heaven, or when they get their heaven, they view heaven as a place in which they're finally relieved from the evils of the world or from any pain and suffering, or is there still a presence?
To my understanding, yes. To become a god, you have to be one of the best Taoists, according to my friend. Like the people who contributed to some of those books, for instance, in their views, they became gods. So, like my friend said, he wanted to become a god, but he doesn't think he's going to in this life. You have to be one of the best. Yeah.
It's interesting that in the Tenshi
Genshi.
movement, in that period of time happens to be the same period of time that Christianity through the Eastern Church had a very strong presence in China in that 5th and 6th century. I wonder if there's any connection between forgiveness of sins that happens to be, those very similar themes.
Yeah, I wondered myself if they kind of got those ideas from Christianity. I didn't specifically research if that was the case, though, yet. Yeah.
So you said they had to be like one of the best Taoists to go to their heaven. It talks a lot about mindfulness or doing what is natural. Is it mainly focused on like the mindset you have that gets you to heaven, or is it like the things you do that get you to heaven?
Yeah, I mean, I think those could probably be tied together. There's a lot of emphasis on sort of going with the flow, letting go. I think one of those things that was a little too tiny to read talked about that, how, let me just find it.
Top cartoon.
By letting go, you become free. Yeah, this idea of effortless action and naturalness is that nature seems to subtly just and effortlessly flow and do what it does. And so sort of realizing and becoming part of that reality, I think, takes both the mindset and the action, or lack of action, in a sense.
How did, you had in the previous slide of the history, how did Taoism and Confucianism work together? Because Taoism is about yourself, Confucianism is about society.
Yeah. So I didn't research too much about how Confucianism works, but Taoism, some of the Taoist literature, like the Tao Te Ching, was in reaction to Confucianism and Buddhism of the day. So the Tao Te Ching was compiled and used politically to oppose competing ideas. But then over time, with persecution, in a sense, of Taoism, it became able to integrate other systems of thought. Even to the point where some people wouldn't refer to it so much as a religion as a philosophy or a way of life, which, from my knowledge, limited knowledge of Confucianism, doesn't conflict with that, per se.
So when talking to a Taoist friend, like, how would you suggest, like, where do you suggest starting? How would you suggest, like, engaging in a conversation with them?
Yeah, well, I'm still learning that myself. I mean, when it comes to Christianity, bringing back to Jesus in general, someone had asked about what they think of Jesus. My Taoist friend, all I know of what he thinks of Jesus right now is that he thinks Jesus was white. So they have a limited knowledge of who he is my guess. And at a certain point, you have to come face to face with the claims that he makes about himself that directly conflict with what Taoism teaches. Some of those verses, I mean, don't just use the verses that contradict them, but in general try to build bridges and show just like, this is what Jesus says. What do you think about that?